Okay. So this is podcast number 3, and we have a new guest. So if you can introduce yourself and kind of some of the questions that I stated before.
Okay, so just cut me off if I start rambling, but
Mhm.
my name is Lindsey Grossman, and I am currently a licensed clinical mental health counseling associate in North Carolina, currently pursuing my Ph.D. in counseling and counselor education at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. So I'm kind of straddling the worlds of counseling and academia, which I know you know what that is like. And I identify as Jewish, definitely. I was raised conservative Jewish, which is like kind of in the middle. So they're like
Mhm.
Reform, which is a little more modern, a little more progressive. And then there's Orthodox, which is like black hats and very traditional, what do I want to say, customs.
Mhm.
And that's much more, they're called Orthodox because they're very Orthodox with everything that they do. And conservative is somewhere in the middle. So I was raised in a very, very, very small congregation in Tallahassee, Florida, because there's not a lot of us in Tallahassee,
Mhm.
and most of the Jews that are there are Reform. So I didn't grow up with a rabbi. It was kind of, I like to describe my synagogue growing up as like a grassroots organization, because we have just like different community members lead services every week. We have different community members kind of running the religious school and making sure we have religious school teachers and people volunteer their time to help train bar and bat mitzvah students. So
Oh,
yeah, so
that's
I
cool.
loved it. Yeah, and it was like very much like, my parents' friends might be running religious school, or like, kids my older brother's age are volunteering after school to train me for my bat mitzvah, or, whatever it is. So that was pretty cool and also a little bit different. Like in Atlanta, there's so many synagogues. I worked at a synagogue before I started our master's program. Um,
Oh.
so yeah, so and it was so different because I worked at this giant, I'll call it historic conservative synagogue in Atlanta that's been there for a really long time, like maybe since like, I don't want to date it because I'm going to get it wrong, but
Yeah.
it's been there a long time. A lot of people know of this synagogue. They had two rabbis at the time. I think they might have three now.
Oh,
But it was
that's a lot.
yeah, yeah. And it was almost like culture shock for me because I didn't grow up with a rabbi. And then all of a sudden I'm
Mhm.
working in this synagogue where there's not one, but there's three, and they all have different responsibilities. And I'm like, how did we manage for so long without?
How
Um,
did you
and I,
adjust to that?
how did I adjust? Well, I got to know the rabbis, made them a little bit more
Mhm.
human for myself so that they weren't so kind of elevated. Um, and then I just asked a lot of questions. It was a lot of like, I don't want to call it self-deprecating humor, but that is kind of culturally Jewish, so might as well say that. But I'm very open to asking questions. Like I'm not afraid
Mhm.
of embarrassing myself by asking questions. I think it shows that I'm curious and I want
Mhm.
to know.
Yeah.
So I just asked a lot of questions of the rabbis themselves, the other people who worked at the synagogue. Um, but I kind of had a lot to learn there as well.
Yeah.
And then there were things where like I had kind of interesting ideas to contribute when we were planning different events or assigning responsibility, because I come from a synagogue where like people are invested. Like we can give congregants more responsibility because they want to
Mhm.
help build this community too. Um, so I don't know. I adapted the way you adapt to anything. I kind of got to
Yeah.
know the people and went from there. But yeah, my like Jewish identity is kind of somewhere between reform and conservative now.
Mhm.
I have a history of working at a reform sleepaway camp. I don't know if anyone
Mm.
has talked about sleepaway camp in your.
Mm-mm.
So Jewish camping is a phrase. So like Jewish sleepaway camp is a very formative part of a lot of young American Jews' lives. So I worked at a Jewish summer camp that was reform because my Jewish friends in Tallahassee, of which I had exactly four. Um,
Wow.
yeah, two of them
Jeez.
were reform. And so they had gone to this camp and they came back. We were in like third grade or something. And they came back. They're like, you have to go to this camp. So we went to reform summer camp, even though we were technically conservative. And
Mhm.
then I took like a 10-year break from camp. And then when I was in college, I went back to the camp that I went to as a kid and worked there for 2 full summers. But I actually went back the year after graduating with my master's as like the mental health person.
That's so cute.
Yeah. But that was reform. So I've been kind of like
Mhm.
straddling these two worlds of reform and conservative. And then of my synagogue for like 8 years
Mhm.
in a row. So that was a big part of my childhood. When I was training for my bat mitzvah, I was at the synagogue 6 days a week doing different things,
Ooh.
like getting ready. Like it was a very big part of my upbringing.
Mhm.
And now I would say, as an adult and a very busy doc student, it's much less a part of my day to day, week to week. Oh, I love being Jewish culturally. I take pride in like the Jewish foods that I eat, or like saying kind of Yiddish phrases and words.
Mhm.
Um, I grew up where there weren't a lot of Jews, and I just had to be either proud of it, or it's almost like I don't even know if I want to compare it this way. I think it can be like invisible disability, in
Mhm.
that when you're raised and you're living in communities that don't have much knowledge of Jewish people, you're kind of presented with a choice of like, do I want to be Jewish in this space, or am I simply going to like hide it or not bring it up?
Mhm. I
And
have heard
so,
that a lot.
yeah, that's interesting. So,
Yeah.
it's something that I think you get away with, not get away with. I think it's less of an option, a personalized option, when you live in places where people can recognize traditionally Jewish traits.
Mhm.
Um, but being in Tallahassee, like I didn't even know until I went to Jewish summer camp and I was interacting with like 400 Jews at a time. I couldn't tell you what was like a Jewish name. Like I didn't know how
Mm.
to identify those things because I didn't know a lot of Jews. I was raised in
Yeah.
a very small community. It's interesting in that I'm not really used to big Jewish community. That's not my thing. And
Mhm.
like being in Greensboro now, I'm teaching undergraduate classes, and I have several students who say to me like, you're the first Jewish person I've ever met. And I'm
Ah.
so we do like a multicultural project for my
Mhm.
class, and they're like doing projects on the Jewish culture, and they're attending
That's
Jewish services
good.
and writing all these things, and I'm just like, we really are still like a small number of
Mhm.
people, which was kind of another culture shock for me because I just didn't know that they didn't know.
So
Yeah.
until I did this project, I was like, whoa. I'm just kind of flabbergasted by all the holidays and the customs, and then you could be culturally, but religiously. Like, it's just so much. I went down a rabbit hole. And then just doing this, talking to everyone from the community, is just like, I'm shocked every interview.
Well, and it is like, I'm shocked a lot of the time when I meet Jewish. It's like any identity. Like there's so much
Hmm.
diversity within the label. Like Jewish, it means everything and it means nothing. Like you can do it all kinds of ways. Um, but it is, I don't know, it is interesting. And for some reason, when you asked me these questions, thinking about it in like the lens of multiculturalism and being kind of aware, I almost want to draw a parallel between this like model minority concept, which I think
Hmm.
puts Jewish people in a unique situation a lot of the time. Um, because I think a lot of the stereotypes or like biases that people are kind of socialized into towards Jewish
Hmm.
people, they think maybe they come off as compliments. Like,
Hmm.
oh, well, like Jewish people are like doctors and lawyers, or like Jewish people are fill in the blank. It's not usually, I mean, greedy. What, I don't know if you know the
Yeah.
stereotypes. There are some bad
Hmm.
ones. I will give you that.
Yeah.
And they usually go back to being like highly educated and very privileged in a lot of ways. So it's kind of, I don't know, it is definitely a weird gray area to be
Yeah.
Jewish in America, especially today when, like, the insurrection on the Capitol, the people are wearing like Nazi paraphernalia and
Hmm.
referencing the Holocaust, and no one talks about it. Like, no
It's
one
so
was talking about
scary.
it as like an anti-Jewish event, but it was like overtly anti-Jewish
Hmm.
at this thing. Because a friend of mine over the summer, we all know about the protests this summer, and
Hmm.
race was a topic that I hope a lot of people were talking about this summer, and I know
Yeah.
that a lot of us were. And a friend of mine who is Jewish and also very much Eastern European white, like she is
Mhm.
white, posted an Instagram story where she said she called herself white passing.
Mm.
And I had a personal reaction to this. I thought that this was inappropriate and not right.
Mhm.
And I was complaining to my brother about it and processing it with my brother.
Yeah.
And he surprised me by saying, I think it was inappropriate the way that she used it. And privately, I don't think she's 100% wrong. And here's why. And I
Mhm.
was like, what are you going to say? Like, we are white. In my mind, we are white. Like, I walk
Yeah.
into a room and they see a white girl. That's what's happening.
Mhm.
And my brother was like, yes, that is true. Like, we have white privilege. I don't want to like take that. I'm
Mhm.
not having a debate about if we have white privilege. I was like, okay, good. We're on the same page so far. Um, but he said, when people talk about white people, they're talking about like the unoppressed.
Mhm.
And the Jews, historically, time and time again, are blamed for things, exterminated in
Mhm.
mass numbers. Like, we we grew up with this generational trauma and this
Mhm.
like fear of re-victimization that happened. I mean, like, my sister and I in ninth grade, someone drew swastikas on notebook paper and stuck them in our locker, and we were called Jew in the parking lot. Like, that's what it's like to be Jewish in Tallahassee, Florida. Not great.
Horrible.
And I guess, with any identity conversation, like, we're all more than one thing.
Mhm.
And I am just recently kind of starting to process, like, how does white, how, how does Jewish present as an ethnicity versus a religion?
Mhm.
And how do we kind of negotiate that with very overt whiteness? Like, a lot
Yeah.
of Jews in America are like Eastern European, pale skin, very like white.
Mhm.
So I don't know, maybe my friend wasn't so wrong to say white passing in this context of like history of oppression. I don't know. It still doesn't
But you
really sit.
sparked, yeah, I kind of agree with the statement too, because you sparked something that is the truth. Like, unfortunately, with the Holocaust and the generational trauma, it is significant trauma, significant blaming and hatred that still goes on today. And I was telling Ula too, like, that's something that connects me. I feel connected with the Jewish community because the same way with slavery, like, our history is fragmented. We're oppressed still. We're talked about this and that. And unfortunately, if you're not a white Christian male, you're not benefiting from all sides of privilege. So unfortunately, Christianity, I can never say the word religion, will always kind of get the number one spot and always be held the highest. And if you're anything below that, unfortunately, you are classified as a minority. So that is a
Yeah,
good topic.
it is. And I will also say, because I don't know how many people know this, but like, there's a long history of allyship between Jews and Black people
Hmm.
in America. And I guess I would say in Western society,
Hmm.
because of this kind of shared oppression in
Hmm.
different settings and at different levels. But I was actually just at the International Civil Rights Museum. I feel like there's another word in there, but Greensboro, North Carolina is the site of the first sit in of the civil rights movement. So
Mm.
like 4 freshmen at North Carolina A&T, which is an HBCU here in Greensboro,
Yes.
went to their local Woolworths and sat at the lunch counter. And that was their
Mm-hmm.
plan. And it spread across the South based on these 4 18-year-old boys who came up with
Mm-hmm.
it. And so in Greensboro, there's a museum that's built around this preserved section of the Woolworths.
Wow.
Like the whole, not only like the seats they sat in, and Vice President Kamala Harris sat at the counter last week. That was pretty cool. But it's like the whole thing, like where the servers were in the back, like it's preserved where it
Wow.
was, how it was standing in the 60s, like
Mm-hmm.
totally. So anyway, I was there this morning, and the tour guide was telling me that at the time, and I don't know why she chose to represent these identities, but it's just what she said. She said
Yeah.
at the time, like the Black students were leading the movement, but at this Woolworths and with segregation, if you were Jewish or Catholic, you were as good as Black. Like it was the same thing.
Mm.
You were not allowed to sit. You were not, whatever. And she said, the difference is people might not know that that's your identity,
Mm-hmm.
but if they knew, you would not be welcome to sit down.
Yeah.
And as a Jewish person who's like, we all learn about the Holocaust. It's in my family.
Yeah.
I know about our history of oppression. But I was with my friend who's like from the northeastern region of the country, and she's blonde and she's Catholic. And I didn't think she'd have any personal relation to this movement. And then we're told she wouldn't be able to sit there either. And you're just like, there's a lot more people with things in common than the people who were
Yes.
able to sit down without any heckling.
Yes. And Rabbi Benner, I'm glad you mentioned civil rights. She told me that there's actually Jewish leaders and activists like marching with MLK, and people don't talk about that. It's like a hidden historical fact. But she was telling me, and I was like in shock because I'm like, you only hear about the Black leaders during civil rights. But she's like, no, we were standing next to you guys and we were helping and we were marching, we were in protests. And that's what I mean. Like this whole experience has just been such a learning experience because it's like you don't even read that unless I haven't found it. But in my opinion, so far, I don't hear anything besides Holocaust and Anne Frank.
Yeah, it's not in the mainstream to talk about other
Yeah.
kind of Jewish presence. But I will say, like, I think that's what allyship is. Like, I don't think that the Jews who were marching with the civil rights marches were there to have their names be remembered. It's like they were there protecting the people who were trying to get their rights, and we're all tied together. And I think that's beautiful and important. And I'm not mad that you don't know the names of every Jewish person
Yeah.
from but I will say, the summer camp that I worked at, the oldest unit in camp are like 10th graders.
Mm.
And every year they have a civil rights trip from camp. So like
Oh.
it's a 5-day that we rent a big what's it called, charter bus, and they're all
Mm-hmm.
bused, and they go to Selma, Alabama, and they tour the South, and they like
What?
go through the cil rights movement, and they learn about the Jewish presence and how their history
Yeah.
is tied in. But it's a huge part of the social justice identity of Jews, which
Mm-hmm.
something I love about being Jewish is that social justice is a big part of it.
Okay. And then my next question, as a counselor, and it's going to be future counselor educator doctor, what would you say is some counseling considerations or things to keep in mind when working with Jewish clients or even students, since you are going to be an educator?
Um, I think an important thing to keep in mind, as always, is that identity is a very personal and individual experience.
Mm-hmm.
So, as with any identity, let's avoid assumptions if you're going to be
Yeah.
working with a Jewish person. And I think knowing about this kind of model minority trap, and for better or worse, this kind of, I've decided to call it an invisible identity. I'll call it that, an invisible
Mm-hmm.
identity. Um, and just being comfortable naming that, whether it's been good, bad, mixed bag, any Jew in America has a story about being a Jew in America. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
not just, you know, it it's not simple. It's complicated for
Yeah.
everyone. and it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I will also say, one of my favorite things about Judaism, and this is particularly highlighted in Reform Judaism, which is why I'm attracted to it, it's like our duty as Jews to question things. And to me, that's
Mm.
like inherently, what's the word? Like progressive's not the word I want, but it's like there's a Jewish value called tikkun olam, and it means repair the world. And
Yes.
have people talked about this?
Yes.
So basically, like it's our job to assess like how's this going and how can I be a part of making it better.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but like, you know, when a Jew comes in with a crisis of faith, which may or may not ever happen, that's probably complicated because it's not
Mm-hmm.
just, you know, we believe in an omnipresent God, and it's complicated and it's cultural and it's the food and it's the holidays and traditions and Holocaust and like intergenerational trauma and all of this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Um, and like any identity, people are going to have strong feelings about it, and some people aren't. Like it's just going to be another thing about that, you know?
Yeah.
So, but I would say keeping those things in mind of just like leaning into the nuance and letting the client lead and tell you what being Jewish means to them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because it's like anything. It, you know, if you see Jewish on your intake form, there's not a lot of things that you can just like 100% know about that
Yeah.
person simply because they wrote that word.
Mm-hmm. And what I'm hearing from everyone I have interviewed, that it really varies your experience on where you live. So, of course, if you're seeing a client who's in Atlanta who identifies as Jewish versus you coming from Tallahassee, that's completely different perspectives in the Jewish community.
Totally. And has anyone mentioned Jewish geography?
No.
So this is a game that a lot of us like to play where if you say, you know, oh, I know Ashley Cohen and she grew up in Tallahassee. Do you know her? And I might say, I don't know her, but I went to camp with a girl who grew up in Tallahassee and she might know her. Let me ask. And like putting together the people because we are often connected. Like the 6 degrees thing is heightened with the Jews and we're spread out all over. And like
Mm-hmm.
it's I mean, I'm wanting to say something about the word diaspora. Like the Jewish diaspora is a very real thing and relocate. Has anyone mentioned like Ashkenazi versus Sephardic Jews?
No.
Okay, so Ashkenazi Jews are like me. Like my ancestors come from Russia and Poland, and we are very Eastern European. We're pale, and like use Yiddish words, and that's Ashkenazi. So like,
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of American stereotypes about Jews are based on Ashkenazi Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Sephardic Jews are from like Spain and Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So Sephardic Jews, they have like different tunes, their foods are different, their traditions are different. Like it's so different. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just based on regionally where they're from because culture is so
Wow.
based on where you're from.
Wow. So
So
that's
like
something to keep in mind.
we even have like different kosher rules for different holidays. Like Sephardic Jews say such
What?
and such is okay. And Ashkenazi Jews are like, no, we were told that that wasn't okay. And it's because if you were Sephardic, you were in regions where, you know, the food that was available to you was this, like,
Mm-hmm.
I won't get into
That's
the
so
specifics of it.
confusing.
There's so many things. So we got Orthodox, conservative, reform, we got Ashkenazi, we got Sephardic, like we got a lot
Yeah.
going on.
So as a counselor, you really can't assume because you don't know what they're coming with.
No, it's, I mean, I hesitate to compare, edit this out if it comes off any kind of way, but it's like assuming that someone who's Black is African American. And
Mhm.
it's like, that's, probably, that's could not be true. Like that just might not
Yeah.
be at all true. They might not have any ties to Africa.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a similar thing. It's like, it's not inherently offensive, like
Hmm.
to say that, but it's making an assumption based on stereotypes that don't apply.
Yeah. And it just shows that we're just all complex individuals. So just because you do identify doesn't mean you're the majority of that because we all have culture within our own culture. So it's important to recognize that.
Totally.
And every Jewish family, like your family, would probably be different from Ula's family or Rabbi Benner's family. Like y'all are, but y'all still identify as Jewish, just separately. Y'all might do things differently.
Yeah. And it can also be really, really unifying. Like when I was in the master's program and Ula invited me over for Shabbat dinner, that was like amazing for me. I got to be with family. I knew the prayers. I think we used the same tunes.
That like makes my heart warm.
Yeah.
That you guys can connect somehow, some way. It's just kind of looking out and finding that. Any other cultural considerations you could think about, or? And if not, we can move on. I just wanted to make sure.
I would say another reminder that the Holocaust wasn't that long ago. So like, it feels very like one piece of a really big story, and we often get kind of stuck in this Holocaust narrative because that's the narrative that a lot of people have. That's the exposure, which great. Everyone should know about the Holocaust, it's real, all that stuff. And I think it's become kind of fantasized in the amount of like novels and movies and like fascinating stories, because obviously horrible times heighten emotion, heighten the stakes. Like there's a lot of interesting stories to tell. And like, so my mom's job, she works for the state of Florida, and her job is to get Holocaust survivors and their descendants restitution from what was taken from them from the Holocaust. So like these people are her clients. Like they're still here, still haven't been repaid. Have a lot of Holocaust survivors are living below the poverty line. Like it's still very much a part of the lived experience of a lot of Jews, because a lot of us lost grandparents in the Holocaust, but a lot of us have survivors in our families who are still very much a part of the current day. And so I think just understanding that a lot of Jews that you meet have a personal story about the Holocaust, which I think I think that's kind of lost a lot of times. It feels like such a long time ago, and it feels like it was in Europe, it was far away. My mom actually is just listening for her book club to the book Cast. Have you heard of the book Cast? I think it's by someone named Isabel, something with a J. But she just learned in this book, her whole career is about helping Holocaust survivors. I think she knows everything about the Holocaust. And she learned in this book that the Nazis came up with their like segregation laws and like the laws for how to separate the Jews from the rest of the population. They got them from the American law books. Like they mirrored what we did to make that happen. And like that blew my mind. I had no idea. But yeah, our country's got a lot of work to do.
Yes.
That's where we are.
Yes, we definitely have a lot of work to do. And I like that you mentioned that, because it's not that long ago, the Holocaust, when you still have grandparents still living. So that's literally only like 2-3 generations. That's not long.
No.
Not long at all. And then, of course, trauma, as we know as counselors, it can spread down from generation to generation, and also processing that out and passing it on to your children. It's just so complex.
Yeah, totally. Totally. So yeah, I would just say, know that things like the Holocaust is probably personal for whoever it is you're talking about. And, we don't know what that might mean for them. So let your client tell you what their connections are.
Okay. And then what are some ways we can get involved or help out if you're not part of the Jewish community, without being offensive, but also like showing like, I want to learn more, or how can I help?
That is a great question. Well, there's actually a ton of like Jewish serving organizations. So like there's even a few like masters in social work programs will have like Jewish community work as like a path, because it's such a strong part of kind of our culture, is like from generation to generation, and protecting the people and repair the world, all that stuff. Very social justice-y. So there's tons of like nonprofits that are Jewish serving. Like Ula works at Jewish Family and Career Services,
Mm-hmm.
and there are JF and CS centers all over the country. I don't know, just be friends with Jews.
Yeah, that's also good though too, for good exposure.
Yeah. And I will also say, Jews are not evangelists. Like, we are not trying to convert people to Judaism. If people
Mhm.
want to convert, they can, but that's
Yeah.
not really the goal in Judaism.
Mhm.
That said, it's a very easy community if you just want to see what it's about.
Mhm.
Like, all services are open. So like if you're, and I'm speaking about in the context of like the project I assigned to my undergrads, it's like
Mhm.
if you want to immerse yourself in another culture, you need to be meeting the people. And how do you do that?
Yeah.
You go into their communities.
Mhm.
So you can go to like a Friday night service, and hot tip, any religious service for the Jews, we end with food. So there's going to be snacks. But someone will come up to you and be like, "Are you new? What are you doing here?" And if you say like, "Well, I just never been to Jewish services," they'll be like, "Oh, well, what made you come? Like, what do you think?" You know, we're a chatty people, we're a welcoming people. So there's no pressure to like become one of us, but it's
Mhm.
definitely like open door policy for anyone who wants to just see what it's about.
That's good to know because I definitely don't. I definitely want to be more hands-on within the community, but
Hmm.
I also don't want to be offensive when they're like, "Why are you here?"
Hmm. And I will say for young people particularly, there's a lot of like between college age and like child family age, there's a
Mhm.
lot of like young adult targeted events and groups and
Mm.
things. I was in one when I was in Atlanta. It's called Moisha House, and it's just like a house where some young Jewish people live together and they host events all the time.
Oh.
So when I was working in a synagogue, I got to know all the kind of Jewish things around town.
Yeah.
And there was a girl who came like to so many events. These were her people, these were her friends, and she wasn't
Mhm.
Jewish. Like, she was never Jewish, but like, you know, she had one friend who invited her to come. They were nice. She kept coming back because the events are like, you know, barbecue or like
Yeah.
Super Bowl or what, like they're not like services. It's just to
Mhm.
get Jewish people to find friends basically in their
Yeah.
cities. And she was like, I'm into having Jewish friends. And she was there all the time. She was great.
But that is the start to just building your cultural competency. It's just definitely connecting. You can't sit there and read about things because that's just textbooky. And so
Yeah.
that's why I was saying, like, in all my life in middle school, high school, college, like, we just read about the same things with the Jewish
Mhm.
community. And I'm like, this is great. Like what you said, everyone should know about the Holocaust, but I want to hear your voice. I want to hear your experience. I want to know how can I help you. And so I just think that is you're highlighting an important point that we have to connect with people to know
Yeah.
about the cultures. And that's what any religion, race, ethnicity, anything.
Yeah.
So,
And I will say, like, I think Jewish erasure is still a thing.
mm,
In that I'm speaking to one very specific example, but I don't know if you heard about it. There was a show on HBO that a lot of people were watching like 6 months ago or something called The Undoing, and it starred Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant, very white,
yes,
waspy
I've seen
couple.
that.
It was so good. Obsessed.
Yes.
You know me, I'm like a movie person and TV person. So I watched the show, I'm obsessed, and I'm searching, and I found out it was based on a book. And then I found this
Oh,
article that was like differences between the book and the show. And so I clicked it. And it turns out they're like an Upper West Side, very Jewish family in the book. And their Jewish culture and community are a huge part of the book. And they just like got rid of it so that they could cast Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant
oh, that annoys me though.
and appeal to the mainstream. Like, you know, the
Yes.
Jews still are like a very small percentage of this country. And they were like, well, if we get rid of all this like specific Jewish stuff, it'll be more relatable. It's like, all right, well, it could have been interesting to see the Jews at
Yes.
Zabar's. It would have been fun.
And that's what
That's a
we
grocery
were
store.
that's like just oh that makes me mad because that's literally what we are talking about in my social justice class, like We watched a TED Talk on America Fiara. I think I'm saying her name
Ferreira.
wrong. Yeah, and she was talking about how she was like declined all these roles because they were saved for white actors who did not identify as this or that, and that's like the same thing.
Mhm. And
That's
I will say,
ridiculous.
it's really cool. My sister is now actually the casting assistant on Grey's Anatomy and All Rise, which are two shows that are very focused on creating a representative world on TV.
Yes, she works with famous people.
Yeah, she does. But it's cool to hear her like casting meetings
Mhm.
because instead of saying like we're holding this for a white woman, they'll say things like, well, this nurse actually needs to be a Filipino nurse because actually a lot of Filipino women who come to the US go into nursing, like proportionally, and none of our
Mhm.
nurses, you know, we need to represent that if we're going to be a
Yeah.
hospital in the US. And so it's kind of cool to watch the way that casting is shifting. And she's
Yeah.
on some pretty hyper aware shows, which is nice for
Good.
her.
Yes.
um, but it is, you know, as long as we're not always holding for white people and making a little more space.
Yeah. Diversify
Yes. But
it.
yeah.
Okay. Well, do you have anything else to add?
No, but I'm sorry I
Or
took up so much of your time.
no, you're fine. Because I say 30 minutes, but of course, if you talk more or anything, that's fine because I'll edit out some things. But if it's still over 30 minutes, is over 30 minutes. I think this is stuff people need to know and hear. And I hope that people do watch the whole podcast versus bits and pieces and everything. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording.